The United States of America is in the middle of the biggest infrastructure race this country has ever seen. Across the country, billions of dollars are being poured into giant data centers built to power the future of AI. But behind the glossy renderings and trillion-dollar promises, something is going terribly wrong. Power grids are being pushed to the brink. Entire towns are running out of electricity. Water supplies are under pressure. Costs are exploding. And it is accelerating so fast that the infrastructure is struggling to keep up. Some of the biggest projects, like the massive Stargate initiative, are already facing serious questions about whether they can even survive. This is not a story about the future of technology. It's a story about a future that Americans may not be ready for. The idea of a data center is simple. Thousands of servers, essentially powerful computers, stacked in rows inside a climate-controlled building, connected to the internet, running constantly. Every time you send an email, stream a video, search for something online, or tap an app on your phone, a request travels to one of these buildings, gets processed, and sends something back. The whole thing happens in milliseconds. The building itself is invisible to you. It could be anywhere. The first large-scale data centers appeared in the 1990s, built by early internet companies that needed somewhere to house their growing server infrastructure. They were modest by today's standards, the size of a large office building, drawing the power of maybe a few thousand homes. The internet was young, traffic was light, and the buildings that powered it could be tucked quietly into industrial parks without anyone noticing. Then came Google, then Facebook, then Netflix, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft. The internet stopped being a place people visited occasionally and became the substrate of daily life. Always on, always connected, processing billions of requests every second, and the buildings behind all of that grew with it. By the 2000s, a new category had emerged, the hyperscale data center. Facilities so large they required their own power substations, their own water supply agreements, their own dedicated grid connections. A single hyperscale facility could cover the area of several football fields, draw hundreds of megawatts of power continuously, and run every second of every day without interruption. Between 2019 and 2024, the number of hyperscale data centers in the world doubled. They didn't just grow, they multiplied, and they changed the places they landed in. Northern Virginia became the first and clearest example. Today, Virginia leads the country with 663 operational data centers and 595 more either under construction or planned. The cluster around Ashburn in Loudoun County became known as Data Center Alley, the single densest concentration of internet infrastructure on Earth. Roughly a third of all global internet traffic passes through it every day. Since then, the county's tax base has exploded. Land values around the facilities have risen sharply, and the clusters of data centers now consume more than a quarter of the state's total electricity supply. A single hyperscale facility uses as much electricity annually as 100,000 homes. For a long time, most people in the communities hosting these buildings simply didn't know they were there. Data centers don't have customers walking through the door. They don't have signs. They don't generate noise or smells that travel. They sit behind fences, gray and enormous, and the only evidence of their existence is the hum of cooling systems and the flicker of electricity meters running faster than anyone expected. But there are two things these buildings cannot hide, and both of them eventually show up on a bill. The first is electricity. Data centers run hot. Thousands of servers generate enormous amounts of heat, and that heat has to go somewhere. Cooling systems consume nearly as much power as the servers themselves. A large facility draws power around the clock, rain or shine, whether demand is high or low, whether the grid is under stress or not, and their presence in a market changes the price for everyone else. A Bloomberg analysis found that electricity costs in areas near large data centers are as much as 267% higher than they were 5 years ago. In Arizona, the state utility board passed an 8% rate hike specifically to fund the new electricity demand from data centers. Residents didn't vote for it, they just received the bill. The second thing data centers can't hide is water. Cooling a building full of servers generating that much heat requires water. enormous quantities of it, used in evaporative cooling systems where much of it simply evaporates into the air and is gone. In 2023, America's data centers directly consumed about 17 billion gallons of water. To put that in terms that make sense, that is enough water to fill around 25,000 Olympic swimming pools, used in a single year by buildings most people have never seen, in communities that were never asked. In Texas, data centers are projected to use 49 billion gallons of water in 2025 alone, and as much as 399 billion gallons by 2030. That would be equivalent to drawing down Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States, by more than 16 feet in a year. And this is the story of the data centers that existed before AI, the ones built for email, for streaming, for social media, for cloud storage, the ones that were, by the standards of what is coming, small. Because in 2022, something changed. A company called OpenAI released a product called ChatGPT to the public. Within 2 months, it had 100 million users, the fastest adoption of any consumer technology in history. And the data centers that had been quietly humming on the edges of American towns suddenly weren't big enough anymore. Not even close. When ChatGPT launched in November 2022, most people experienced it as a curiosity, a chatbot that could write your emails, explain quantum physics, argue both sides of an argument, and occasionally make things up with complete confidence. Interesting, impressive, a little unsettling. What almost nobody was thinking about was the building it lived in. Because behind every conversation with an AI, every question asked, every image generated, every document summarized, is a data center doing something fundamentally different from anything it had done before. And that difference, measured in watts and gallons, is where this problem gets serious. A standard Google search uses about 0.3 watt-hours of electricity. A single ChatGPT query uses roughly 10 times that ChatGPT was handling around 10 million queries a day within weeks of launch. By 2024, it was consuming over 500,000 kilowatt-hours of electricity every single day, equivalent to the daily power usage of 180,000 American households. That is one AI product from one company, before the rest of the industry had fully joined the race. The reason AI is so much more power-hungry than everything that came before, it comes down to what's actually happening inside the building. A traditional data center is largely doing retrieval, finding something that already exists and sending it back to you. AI is doing something different. It is calculating. Every response a large language model generates requires billions of mathematical operations, running across thousands of specialized chips simultaneously, generating heat at a rate that would have seemed implausible a decade ago. The servers required for AI workloads consume several times more power per unit than the servers that ran the old internet, and they run hotter, which means more cooling, which means more water, which means more of everything. Even training a large AI model is one of the most energy-intensive things a computer has ever been asked to do. It requires running calculations across thousands of chips for weeks or months at a time. The energy cost of training a single frontier model has been estimated at the equivalent of flying a commercial aircraft back and forth across the Atlantic thousands of times. And the models keep getting bigger. Each new generation requires more compute than the last. More power, more water, more time. According to a 2024 report by Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, data center energy use has already tripled over the past decade and is projected to double or triple again by 2028. That trajectory is a curve that keeps bending upward. Electricity consumed by AI servers could rise 150-fold in a single decade, reaching 300 terawatt-hours by 2028. That is enough electricity to power over 28 million American households for a year. A January 2026 report predicted that the total energy demand of U.S. data centers will jump from 80 to 150 gigawatts by 2028. That is like adding a country with the energy needs of Spain in just 3 years. The water numbers move in the same direction. In 2024, existing AI data centers consumed as much water as a city of 9 million people uses in 5 months. And that is before the current wave of construction comes online. By 2028, data centers across the country could collectively use as much water as 18.5 million households. In regions that are already running dry, Arizona, New Mexico, West Texas, that is not an abstract environmental concern. It is a competition for a resource that does not have enough supply to go around. The companies building these facilities know all of this, and their public response has followed a consistent pattern: commitments to renewable energy, pledges to be water neutral by a certain year, announcements of new cooling technologies that use less water or none at all. The language is confident, and the timelines are always a few years out. Microsoft claims it will build a zero-water data center by 2027. Google has pledged to be water offsetting by 2030. What those pledges don't change is the fact that hundreds of already operational data centers are consuming water right now, today, using methods that haven't changed, while the communities around them absorb the cost. And the cost lands unevenly, because the return for the communities that are not terminally online is next to nothing. When a tech company announces a new data center in a town, local officials tend to celebrate. $1 billion investment, more tax revenue, more jobs. States compete aggressively to win these projects, offering tax exemptions worth hundreds of millions of dollars to land them. In Texas, data center tax abatements cost the state more than $1 billion in 2025 alone. In Virginia, tax exemptions also cost the state $1 billion in 2024, $2 billion in a single year, from 2 states in tax revenue that never materialized, revenue that would otherwise have funded schools, roads, emergency services. In exchange, the communities get a building, a very large, very expensive, very power-hungry building that employs, once construction is finished, a remarkably small number of people. By the end of 2024, as few as 23,000 people in the entire United States worked permanently in the data center industry. For context, a single Amazon fulfillment warehouse typically employs more than that on its own. Research published in November 2025 by 2 business school professors found no clear evidence that data centers stimulate local growth in tech employment. The construction crews arrive, the building goes up, the crews leave, and what remains is a facility that runs largely on automation, draws heavily on local resources, and employs a skeleton staff. The people bearing the cost are not the people collecting the benefit. The electricity bills go up for every household in the region. The water table drops for every farmer and family drawing from the same source. The tax exemptions reduce the budget available for every school and fire station in the county. And the 50 permanent jobs, when they materialize, go to a small number of highly specialized workers who may not even live locally. That is the data center economy as it currently operates. Not a tide that raises all boats. A drain running quietly that most people don't notice until their bill arrives. And America is currently building thousands of them. The United States currently has over 4,000 active data centers. Another 3,000 have been announced or are already under construction. In 2023, the United States spent about $9 billion on data center construction. In 2024, that number more than tripled. In July 2025 alone, America broke ground on $14 billion worth of new data center projects. That 1 month exceeded the entire first half of the year, which had itself already broken every previous record. Total data center construction spending for 2025 topped $400 billion. To put that in perspective, the entire interstate highway system, 78,000 kilometers of road connecting a continent built over 4 decades, cost roughly $500 billion in today's money. America is now spending nearly that much on data centers in a single year. The companies driving this are the ones we already know. Amazon Web Services announced more than $30 billion in U.S. projects in 2025, including a $20 billion AI hub in Pennsylvania and a $10 billion expansion in North Carolina. Microsoft logged $30 billion in capital expenditures in the first quarter of 2025 alone, almost entirely going toward AI-capable data centers. Google added a further $10 billion to its U.S. data center budget. Meta continued expanding throughout the country, and those are just the ones already built or actively under construction. Virginia alone currently has 663 operational data centers, with 595 more either under construction or planned. Texas has 405 existing facilities and 442 more planned or being built. That's more than 35 gigawatts of data center capacity under construction in North America, an extraordinary volume by any historical standard. The buildings themselves are getting bigger. What used to be considered a large facility, a few hundred megawatts of capacity, is now a mid-sized one. The average cost of building a single data center has risen to $220 million, and that figure keeps climbing as the facilities get larger and more complex. The new generation of hyperscale campuses being planned runs into multiple gigawatts. A single gigawatt facility requires enough substations, cooling infrastructure, and transmission capacity to sustain the continuous power demand of nearly 1 million homes. McKinsey estimated in 2025 that $7 trillion in capital expenditure will have gone to global data center infrastructure by 2030, with over 40% of that spending expected to take place in the United States. $7 trillion. Flowing into an industry that barely existed at scale 15 years ago, an industry that employs, across its entire permanent U.S. workforce, fewer people than a handful of Amazon warehouses. The states absorbing all of this are moving fast to accommodate it. At least 36 states currently offer tax incentives to attract data center projects. Billions in tax breaks handed to an industry generating record profits in exchange for buildings that permanently consume the land, water, and power of the communities that host them. The speed at which this is all moving is itself part of the problem. A hyperscale data center can go from planning to operation in 18 to 24 months. But the power supply is lagging because a new power generation project takes an average of 55 months from application to commercial operation. Transmission infrastructure takes even longer, averaging 6.5 years from permitting to completion. The buildings are arriving faster than the grid can absorb them. In Texas, companies waiting in line to connect to the grid are so backed up that many are simply bringing their own power until a permanent grid connection becomes available, sometimes years later. In December 2025, ERCOT reported it was monitoring roughly 226 gigawatts of large load interconnection requests, up from 63 gigawatts just a year earlier, with roughly 3/4 of those requests coming from data centers. The Texas grid, which already made international headlines during the 2021 winter storm when it came within minutes of complete failure, is now being asked to absorb a demand surge unlike anything in its history. The grid was not designed for this. The water systems were not designed for this. The communities being planted in the middle of it were not asked about any of it. And sitting above all of it, announced at the White House in January 2025 with the kind of fanfare normally reserved for moon landings, is the project that made even the most aggressive data center builders stop and stare. On January 21, 2025, Donald Trump stood in the White House flanked by Sam Altman of OpenAI, Larry Ellison of Oracle, and Masayoshi Son of SoftBank, and announced the largest private technology infrastructure investment in American history, the Stargate project, a new joint venture committing $500 billion over 4 years to build AI infrastructure across the United States, $100 billion to be deployed immediately. The announcement was framed not just as a business investment, but as a national security imperative. America staking its claim as the dominant force in artificial intelligence before anyone else could get there first. The comparisons being made, without irony, were to the Manhattan Project. The centerpiece was Abilene, Texas. On the outskirts of a mid-sized city 180 miles west of Dallas, a 4 million square foot complex is being built across just over 1,000 acres of land. A crew of 6,400 workers has been on site, working around the clock. They have already laid enough fiber optic cable to wrap the earth 16 times. They have flattened hills. They have poured foundations for 8 buildings, 4 of which are already operational, running racks of NVIDIA's most advanced chips, processing AI workloads for OpenAI around the clock. The Abilene site alone is projected to reach 1.2 gigawatts of capacity, comparable, at full scale, to the peak power demand of a mid-sized American city. And Abilene is one of 7 Stargate sites now under active development across the country, with locations in Texas, New Mexico, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Together, the 7 sites add up to over 9 gigawatts of planned capacity, comparable to the peak power demand of New York City. The scale is genuinely staggering, and the problems started almost immediately. The $500 billion figure presented at the White House as a committed investment turned out to be considerably more aspirational than it sounded. By August 2025, Bloomberg reported that the project had not fully started and no funds had been raised to meet the initial $500 billion budget. Market uncertainty, trade policy concerns, and AI hardware valuations had caused delays. SoftBank, the main financial backer, could initially collect only a 10% equity funding. The remaining 90% was expected to come from debt or debt-like instruments. SoftBank's first $10 billion was borrowed from Japanese bank Mizuho and other lenders. A company that had just announced the largest tech infrastructure investment in history was funding it primarily with debt from a partner that was itself borrowing the money. Inside the partnership, things were no smoother. OpenAI and SoftBank disagreed over data center locations. OpenAI's $30 billion deal with Oracle for 4.5 gigawatts of capacity created friction because it was done separately, outside the Stargate structure. Lack of coordination has been reported as a consistent issue. 3 major companies, each with its own agenda, each making billion-dollar commitments independently of each other, all under the banner of a single project. More than a year after the announcement, the Stargate joint venture had not hired any staff and was not actively developing any data centers as a unified entity. The 3 partners had been arguing over responsibilities and how the collaboration should be structured. OpenAI tried to resolve this by building its own data centers independently and ran straight into a wall. Lenders weren't willing to back billion-dollar projects from a company carrying heavy losses and an unproven business model. Only after hitting that wall did OpenAI return to Oracle and SoftBank, this time as bilateral deals rather than a 3-way consortium. Then came the power problem. Texas is expected to see its peak electricity demand increase by more than 60% over the next 5 years. The grid serving Abilene was not designed for what Stargate needs. The Abilene site is currently running on a mix of on-site natural gas generation and whatever grid power is available, a stopgap arrangement that was never meant to be permanent. Companies in Texas are waiting in interconnection queues so long that many have simply given up on grid connection as a near-term solution. They are bringing their own power, smaller turbines, reciprocating engines stacked on site, and planning to run on that for months or years until a permanent grid connection becomes available. One of Stargate's New Mexico sites, Project Jupiter in Doña Ana County, tells the story plainly. The county approved $165 billion in bonds for the project. To power it, developers are seeking permits for 2 on-site natural gas generating stations. The resulting emissions, according to state environment officials, could rival those of New Mexico's 2 largest cities combined. A separate Texas energy company is seeking federal approval to build a dedicated $60 million gas pipeline just to supply the facility. A data center marketed as the future of American technology, powered by a new fossil fuel pipeline, generating emissions equivalent to an entire metropolitan area. The expansion of the Abilene site had its own problems. OpenAI and Oracle had been planning to push the facility from 1.2 gigawatts to 2 gigawatts. That plan was abandoned in early 2026. Financing challenges and changing demand forecasts had slowed negotiations. As discussions dragged on, OpenAI reassessed its near-term infrastructure needs, and the companies decided not to proceed. Microsoft stepped in, taking over the expansion that OpenAI had walked away from, and they built 2 new AI factory buildings right next to the existing Stargate campus. Oracle, meanwhile, is carrying more than $100 billion in debt to fund its Stargate commitments, with free cash flow now negative. The company that is building and operating the physical infrastructure for the most celebrated AI project in American history is doing so while hemorrhaging cash. And through all of it, the jobs numbers have not matched the reality on the ground. Abilene was told Stargate would transform its economy. The projected permanent job count for the Abilene site, the flagship of the entire project, is in the hundreds. For a facility consuming more than a gigawatt of power, drawing water in one of the most drought-prone regions of Texas, sitting on 1,000 acres of land that will never be used for anything else. The OpenAI CFO said something at the September 2025 press event that has not received nearly enough attention. Standing in front of the half-built Abilene campus, she said, "No one in the history of man has built data centers this fast." She meant it as a point of pride, but what she really said could spell doom for millions of residents. No one has ever done this before, at this speed, at this scale, with this much money, this much power, this much water, in places this ill-equipped to handle it, with partners disagreeing on fundamentals, financing built on debt, grid connections that don't exist yet, and a partnership structure that, more than a year after the White House announcement, still hadn't hired a single member of staff as a unified organization. Stargate is real. The buildings in Abilene are real. The chips running inside them are real. But the version of Stargate announced at the White House, that version is considerably more complicated than the press conference suggested. And Stargate, for all its scale, is just one of them. So here is the obvious question. Communities don't want them. Grids can't handle them. Water systems are buckling under them, and the jobs they promised don't materialize. Then why is any of this still happening? The answer requires being honest about what is actually driving this. And the biggest reason for it all is competitive terror. Every major technology company on Earth believes that the company which controls the most AI compute will control the next era of the global economy. They draw comparisons to the way Standard Oil controlled energy in the early 20th century, or the way a handful of semiconductor companies control chip production today. The race is not being run toward a finish line. It is being run away from the possibility of losing. Microsoft cannot afford to let Google pull ahead. Google cannot afford to let Amazon pull ahead. Amazon cannot afford to let OpenAI pull ahead, and none of them can afford to let China pull ahead of all of them combined. Global data center capital expenditures surged 57% in 2025, driven largely by AI demand, and are projected to exceed $1 trillion in 2026. Every billion spent is also a signal to investors, to competitors, to governments that you are in this race and you are not slowing down. When the logic is existential for corporations, the water bills in Goodyear, Arizona become somebody else's problem. And this transformation is being backed by government money and political will. Stargate was not announced by a tech company. It was announced at the White House, flanked by the President of the United States. The federal government has made AI infrastructure a national priority, framed explicitly as a competition with China, with the same strategic weight that the space race carried in the 1960s. At the federal level, new permitting policies have accelerated approvals for large data center projects, shortening environmental review timelines and reducing opportunities for local input. States are stripping away the zoning protections and permitting requirements that communities rely on to have a voice. In West Virginia, lawmakers passed legislation limiting local regulatory authority over data centers and creating Freedom of Information Act exemptions, meaning residents cannot even find out what is being built next to them. When the federal government decides something is a national security priority, the normal levers that communities pull to protect themselves get shorter. Even if there is opposition, the hard truth is that money moves faster than the opposition. However, the grievances against these data centers have been building up for years. A nationwide poll found that only 44% of Americans would welcome a data center in their community, making them less popular than gas plants, wind farms, or even nuclear facilities. Less popular than nuclear, and yet they are going up faster than any infrastructure in modern American history. Residents are up in arms about how these megabuilds are negatively impacting their lives. The noise, industrial cooling systems running 24 hours a day, every day, with no off switch. The diesel generators, each the size of a rail car, permitted to run for 50 hours at a stretch, pumping particulate matter into neighborhoods where children go to school and elderly residents already manage respiratory conditions. The water drawn in places that are already drying. The electricity bills that keep climbing for households that have no connection to the industry driving the increase. Underneath all of it is the anger of communities that have been asked to absorb enormous costs in exchange for promises that cannot be kept. The meetings started small. A few dozen people in a community center in Prince William County, Virginia, asking why the county had approved a $24.7 billion data center development on farmland without a public vote. It built up to a petition with thousands of signatures. Then 3 separate lawsuits were filed against the rezoning approval, working their way through the Virginia court system simultaneously. The PW Digital Gateway Project, 2,300 acres of Northern Virginia countryside, earmarked for one of the largest data center campuses ever proposed, became the flashpoint for something that had been building for years. The project remains delayed, tied up in legal challenges and local opposition, its future uncertain as of early 2026. It was not an isolated case. In Tucson, Arizona, the city council voted unanimously to oppose a $3.6 billion Amazon data center campus after months of sustained community pressure, driven by water concerns that the developer and city officials had not disclosed clearly before the deal was signed. In San Marcos, Texas, the city council paused a $1.5 billion 200-acre proposal after residents pointed out that the surrounding area was already vulnerable to brownouts and that 2 other data centers were already planned to open in the same community. In Prince George's County, Maryland, officials imposed a 180-day moratorium on all new data center proposals after community demonstrations and a petition that gathered over 20,000 signatures. More than $64 billion in data center projects were delayed or canceled between May 2024 and March 2025 due to organized opposition. Thousands of people showed up to city council meetings, filed lawsuits, gathered petition signatures to fight projects that were approved without their knowledge or consent. But $64 billion in delays in an industry spending $425 billion in a single year is less than 15 cents on the dollar. The opposition is real and it is growing. It is not, at the current trajectory, winning because the people making the decisions about where they get built are not the people living next to them. They are in boardrooms and government offices, working from a set of priorities: competitive advantage, national security, investor returns that have very little to do with what a mid-sized Texas town needs from the land on its edge. As resistance has grown on the populated East Coast, rural Western communities and states with fewer zoning hurdles are actively courting the same projects. When one town says no, the developers move to the next county. When one state tightens its rules, the industry shifts to a state that hasn't yet. The capital is too large, the political backing too strong, and the competitive pressure too intense for local opposition alone to redirect. So if there's too much to lose from not building these data centers, and if the resources can't catch up with what they need, then where is the solution? And is this crisis even resolvable? The honest answer is that nobody has a complete solution. Not the tech companies, not the government, and not the environmentalists. What exists instead is a collection of partial answers, some promising, some years away from being real. Start with the grid because that is where the pressure is most immediate. The American electricity grid was not built for this moment. Most of it was designed in the mid-20th century around the assumption that demand would grow slowly and predictably, that large industrial consumers would be few, and that the biggest challenge would be moving power from centralized plants to suburban homes. None of those assumptions hold anymore. A typical data center can commence operations in 18 to 24 months. A new power generation project takes an average of 55 months from application to commercial operation, so the buildings arrive faster than the power to run them. That is a structural gap, and closing it requires investment in transmission infrastructure at a scale America has not attempted since the post-war era. Some states are moving. Virginia passed a new tariff structure in late 2025, requiring large data center operators to pay for at least a portion of the new generation and transmission costs their demand creates, rather than passing those costs automatically to residential ratepayers. The tariff was approved by Virginia's State Corporation Commission in November 2025 and is scheduled to come into force in early 2027. It is a start. It is also one state, applied to future projects while hundreds of existing facilities continue operating under the old rules. Then there is nuclear power. Every major technology company has quietly arrived at the same conclusion, that renewable energy alone cannot power what they are building. Solar and wind are intermittent. Data centers are not. A facility running AI workloads needs power every second of every day, regardless of whether the sun is shining or the wind is blowing. The only carbon-free source of electricity that runs continuously is nuclear. Microsoft signed a deal to restart Unit 1 of the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant in Pennsylvania, specifically to power its data centers. The same plant whose partial meltdown in 1979 defined a generation's fear of nuclear power. Google has signed agreements with multiple small modular reactor developers. Amazon has invested in nuclear startups. The industry that spent a decade making net zero pledges is now betting its energy future on a technology the environmental movement spent 40 years trying to shut down. Small modular reactors, SMRs, are the specific technology most of the industry is pointing toward. Smaller, factory-built, deployable closer to the point of demand than a traditional nuclear plant. The theory is sound. The problem is that no SMR has yet been built at commercial scale in the United States. The first ones are not expected to come online before the early 2030s at the earliest. The data centers being built right now today in Abilene and Goodyear and Prince William County will be running long before a single SMR generates its first watt of power for them. Wikipedia. Efficiency is the other lever, and it is the one that doesn't require waiting for new technology to arrive. The chips powering AI workloads are getting more efficient with each generation. NVIDIA's latest architectures perform significantly more computation per watt than their predecessors. Cooling technology is improving. Liquid immersion systems that eliminate water evaporation entirely are moving from experimental to operational. Some newer data centers are being built with closed-loop cooling systems that recycle the same water for years, dramatically reducing the water draw that has caused so much conflict in drought-prone communities. But efficiency improvements have a ceiling, and the demand projections suggest that this ceiling will be hit long before the appetite for compute stops growing. Every efficiency gain the industry makes gets absorbed by the next wave of larger model, more users, and more complex workloads. The history of computing is full of examples where doing things more efficiently simply enabled doing more things. Regulation is the piece that ties all of this together, and it is the piece most visibly missing. There is currently no clear national framework for regulating data center development in the United States. Local governments are experimenting in real time, some cities pausing development entirely, while others are still waving projects through without public review. A patchwork of county-level zoning decisions is not a strategy for managing the largest infrastructure build-out in modern American history. What would actually work is a national framework that sets minimum standards for water use, for grid impact, for community input, for emissions from backup generation, that applies everywhere, not just in the counties that have figured it out. That requires Congress to treat this as the infrastructure crisis it is, rather than as a technology story best left to the market. So far, it hasn't. Projects like Stargate are exposing the cracks in America's infrastructure planning in real time. And as this race accelerates, the question is no longer whether America can build bigger AI data centers. It's whether the country can survive the consequences of building too many of them, too fast. What do you think? Is America ready for the AI data center boom? And will it all be worth it? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, check out our breakdown of the line, the greatest mega disaster in history. Keep following Signum for more stories about the world's craziest mega projects.